Hi everyone. So it's been kind of a while since I've done a bird video. So Friday night at the shop here for another couple hours. Figured why not? I'm going to do a bird video. So today's topic is going to be something that I think I fight the most about with people when they get birds, and that is a bird cage. Uh, so many people either get a completely off the wall, inappropriate cage for their bird, or they spend $1.5 billion on a bird cage that they don't need. And this only happens really not often at all, so it's really a moot point. But anyway, so how to pick a bird cage for your bird. So the very first thing you're going to want to remember is that assuming you don't have a bird room, your bird is going to spend an awful lot of time in his cage. And you're going to want to make sure you pick a bird cage that reflects that. If you have a small bird, it's probably going to spend its entire life in that cage, and you're going to want to keep that in mind when you pick one out. If you don't want to spend a couple $100 on an appropriate bird cage, then maybe a bird is really not something that you should have. You would never think to put a dog, well, okay, some people do think that this is okay, but you would never put a little dog in a cage for its entire life and assume that was okay. And if you did, you need to go get some psychiatric help. Most people who see hoarding situations where dogs are stuck in tiny little kennels for their entire lives and all they have room to do is turn around and there's no toys and hardly any clean food or water, think that that's absolutely disgusting. But when it comes to birds, for some reason people think that's okay, and it's so not okay. So you're going to want to make sure that your cage is going to be appropriate for the amount of time that your bird is going to be spending in it. And this is kind of why that other thing I mentioned, kind of, you're going to want to make sure that your cage fits that. I know somebody who bought an outdoor aviary for their bird and spent like $3,000 on this huge cage. And although she loved it, it wasn't for the point. It wasn't for the whole space thing, because he spends 99% of his time out of his cage anyway. It was the bottom. Her bird's pretty much allergic to everything, so she can't use paper. It's too dusty, so she has to like wash the floor. So she actually made like a linoleum bottom for the cage. Anyway, before getting this cage, before her bird got sick, she was buying huge aviary cages, and really it kind of didn't make any sense because she was spending thousands of dollars on these cages and the bird never spent a decent amount of time in them anyway, so they pretty much just took up room because you couldn't actually get into the cage and socialize with him because it was huge. So that's really the only situation where you might buy a cage that's too big, but 99.99999% of the time you're going to want to buy the biggest cage you can get away with, and then add like 3 or 4 inches. So when you're thinking of an actual cage to buy, sorry, somebody walked by the window. I wasn't sure who's going to come in. When you're looking for a cage to buy, you're going to want to remember the hokey pokey rule. So you're going to want to do your reading and figure out how big your bird's wingspan is from tip to tip, and you're going to want to figure out how tall they are from the top of their heads to the base of their tails. And then you're going to want to add one of them up, one of them down, and you're going to want to be able to put 2 of them across. That's how big your cage should be. Because at any point in the cage, preferably in the middle, your bird's going to want to be able to do its craziness, flip upside down, flap its wings, carry on, float through water everywhere, toys, what have you, and not hit the sides of the cage. That is an appropriate sized cage. Anything smaller than that is really just cruel. The only time your bird should be in a cage smaller than that is if, let's say for example, your bird is in the living room and you're having company over tonight and you are expecting to be up late, and you move your bird from the living room into your bedroom and you put them in what's called a sleeping cage, which is small, has enough room for food and water, small enough that you can fit in your room without it making a big disturbance, and big enough for them to move around comfortably but feel secure. Excuse me. You're going to want to be sure that you can put food and water dishes in there, a perch, maybe two. Um, for sleeping only has one perch in it. Um, it's his favorite, actually, or one of his favorite. He loves the sandy perches. So he's got one in there. He's got his snuggly blanket on one side, and he's got his food and water dishes on the other. So that's the only time you're going to want them in a particularly small cage. So if they can't do the hokey pokey rule, your cage is too small. Try again. It's not even a discussable point. Like, your bird needs to be able to move around. If you have particularly active birds like lovebirds, budgies, finches, canaries, linneys, kikes, you're going to want a bird cage that's maybe a little bit bigger than that, because these guys are nutcases and they will jump around and bounce and fly and go bananas in their cage, and you're going to want to be able to allow them to do that. So, there's a few exceptions to that rule, and like I said, it's not a smaller cage for those crazy birds, it's a bigger one. If you're planning on your bird to spend its entire life in that cage, then you're going to want a couple inches more than that, because your bird should be able to move around comfortably and be able to fly around, because let's face it, that's what they were built to do. So, just like that dog in that cage that can't go out for a walk, if you're planning on leaving your bird in that cage for its entire life, you're going to want to be able to make sure that it can properly exercise itself and fly around and do its bird thing. Another thing that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're picking a bird cage, especially for birds that, actually for all birds, but I'm going to try my best to stick with hand-fed birds, which is usually what people get, and I encourage people to get if they're looking for a bird. If you want a trophy pet, just get a picture and put it on the wall. You're going to want to make sure that the dishes are in an appropriate place. So most cages have dishes that come with the cage that are accessible from the outside. If you have a bird who is hand-fed, you should have no problem reaching into the cage and switching things around and whatnot. But let's say your bird is a second-hand bird who's been through a lot. You might not want to be sticking your hands in the cage all the time. So you're going to want to look for dishes that open from the outside. You're also going to want to make sure that your bird can't take the dishes out of the holder, like my umbrella cockatoo figured out how to do very quickly. Even though the bowls, we got a cage that claimed that he wouldn't be able to get the dishes out of the holder, but because the dishes are stainless steel and are very light, all he had to do was stick his beak in there and pop them out, and onto the floor they fell. If your bird is prone to doing this, or is known to do this, get ceramic dishes. They're much, much harder for your bird to get out of a holder because they're heavy, and they don't flex like a stainless steel dish will do. You're going to want to make sure that the door is big. If you've ever tried to get a lovebird out of a door this big, it's not fun. Make sure that you've got a nice, big door on the front. I know that some cages, actually, the whole front panel will swing out, which is fabulous, because then there's no inhibitions for your bird thinking, oh my god, I gotta go through that tiny little tunnel. It's kind of like when you're driving down a road and you see two poles on the other side and you're going like this, driving off, oh my god, I hope I don't hit anything. That's kind of how your bird feels. Nice, big door. One of the biggest, I think, things that people with hand-fed babies who, people let their birds out quite often, that they consider is a dome top or a play top cage. Now, I'm partial to play top cages. I like them because they're flat and you can put toys on top of them, especially like play gyms and stuff. I find that the dome tops are, they're hard to fit in some rooms, especially if you have slanted ceilings. I find that they're kind of a waste of space because they're usually really tall and not kind of fat. So your bird has a tendency to stay in that top piece instead of, roaming around the cage. I also don't like that because they're shaped like that, you can't really put anything on top of them, and there's usually not a grate. Now, if you let your birds out, and let's say you have a bird room, I like to keep the grates in the cages, because that way if some other bird decides to come by and land on the top of the cage, A, they can't poop on the bird underneath it, and B, if that particular bird happens to be in his cage, he can't play let's bite this bird's feet off. So that's something that I keep in, like, I like to bring to the forefront of people's minds, is that you're going to want to make sure that you get an appropriate size or an appropriate topped cage for what your bird cage is intended purpose. Like I said, I prefer the play tops. Most of the, well, actually all the time, you can take off the top of it if you want to, which is fabulous. I actually had um, play gyms built for the tops of my cages that fit inside, build kind of like little tray thingy, so that I can extend the height of the cage from the outside. You can also kind of scrap that if you've got a bigger bird. A lot of birds will play like catch with you. If you throw stuff on it, they like to run around, and it gives them somewhere flat for their feet to be instead of constantly grabbing onto stuff. Another thing that you're going to want to consider when you buy a cage, especially if you don't have a bird room, is a cage cover. Now, I'll be the first to admit that most big birds will eat holes in them. So you might want to um, opt not for an expensive cage cover from a particular company, and go with just an old sheet. Dark sheets work best, or a comforter if so long as there's enough ventilation underneath. Like if you have them up against the wall, I usually just do the first two, three sides. So the front and down the sides and leave the back open so there's enough ventilation, especially in the summer when it gets really stuffy. But you're going to want to make sure that you have a way to block out the light. Either if they're in a bird room, you can just close the blinds, turn off the lights, and it's night. Or if they're down in your living room or family room or whatever, you're going to be able to, you know, make it comfortable for them to go to bed. Bedtime is a whole issue, whole can of worms that, you know, I have a lot of fights with people. I know it's hard for a lot of people to see it like this, but you've got to picture your bird like a baby, like a child. You would not put your child to bed on the floor in the living room and turn on the TV and get mad at the child for not falling asleep. And you can't do that to your bird either. If you want your bird to go to bed, then it's going to have to be quiet, just like you would expect a baby's room to be quiet. And I hear my parents are awful for this. Oh, they'll go to bed. They'll just go to bed when they're tired. Like, oh, I'm not, you know. And then they get mad when they get up in the morning and they're cranky. My parents are the worst for doing that when they come over to my house, and I tell them, okay, like, if you want to stay up, that's fine. I can move Goonie into another room and he can have bedtime. But they don't think like that. They don't function like that. If there's noise going on, if there's lights on, they're going to stay up, because how do you sleep through that? Especially a prey animal who's going to be listening to every single thing that's going on. It's just not going to work. So you're going to want to make sure that your cage fits in whatever room that you are planning to put it in. Now, I don't mean, you know, oh, well, my bird cage is too big, so let's get a smaller one. I mean, make sure that your bird fits when you buy it, measure out, you know, the space, and you know, make sure you can get it through the door, and if not, then you're going to have to move some furniture, and maybe take it apart to get it through the door. You're going to want to make sure that it fits in the spot that you've picked, in the sense that you're going to have to move everything else. Like I said, I don't suggest buying a bird cage to fit in the spot because there's a space there, because 9 times out of 10 you're going to buy a smaller cage, not a larger one, and that's really not right. You should be providing the best that you can and the most appropriate that you can, not the best for your wallet or whatever fits in your living room. As far as the color goes of cages, I know a lot of people are really interested in all these bright colors, and I totally think that's cool. My only suggestion is that you buy a cage that you're not or a color that you're not going to regret 3 years from now. So, you know, you might think that pink is a really cool color right now, but in 3 years down the road, when your bird's starting to chip the powder coating off and you've got to redo it, you know, you might not be so thrilled with the color anymore. You don't want to have to replace the whole cage. I also like to keep in mind that putting a white bird in a white cage is not aesthetically pleasing. Goonie grew up in a white cage, and actually the first time I went to the house, I didn't even see him in the cage. So we bought him a black cage. Just remember that, you know, spotting your bird in a white cage is not the easiest thing to do, and it kind of sounds trivial, but, you know, it's something that you might want to consider. I always suggest powder-coated cages. Stainless steel cages are nice, but they are heavy, as are cast iron cages, really, really heavy. I like the A&E line. I have had, actually I do have, King's cages. Again, I find them really heavy, which kind of goes with the material. And I find that they were built very tall and very narrow, and you want it the other way around. You want it, you know, longer than it is tall, because birds fly back and forth and not up and down like helicopters. So keep those things in mind when you're picking out a bird cage. You're going to want to make sure that it's got room for the bird and toys and perches, and still has enough room for the bird to be a bird and do bird things. If you have any questions, leave them below. I hope you learned something, because learning things are cool, and I will see you next time.